Hi, everybody. This is Glenn Woodworth, and I'm with the Society for Education and Anesthesia webcast series on innovations in anesthesia education. And today it's my great pleasure to have Sumeet Gopwani, and he is an assistant professor of anesthesiology at MedStar Georgetown University. He's the director of pediatric anesthesia and also director of their wellness engagement group, which I'm sure has had a lot of activity during this time in the pandemic. So, Sumit, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Dr. Woodworth. I'm excited to be here, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to discuss my research work.
Yeah, now this is a really interesting project, and I'm really hoping that some of us will be able to do this because the title of today's talk is Automated Case-Based Directed Reading Improves Resident and Teaching Evaluations. So all stuff, we like the words automated and we like the words improve evaluations. All right, so I think it's fairly obvious that the problem that you were trying to solve, but maybe from in your own words, tell us a little bit about what attracted you to this project.
Yeah, so the problem we were trying to solve really in sort of like in terms of like the learning theory problem was that classically the anesthesia departments I've been a part of have done like lecture-based education. And so we get all of our trainees, med students, residents together to do lectures every morning. Um and I feel the in terms of adult learning theory, we feel like that sort of education is great for younger learners who are going to absorb information that they might use, a decade later. But we felt like our adult learners really want to learn based on what they're doing immediately that day or that week in a much more targeted way. And so our goal or the problem we were trying to solve was we wanted to sort of remake the educational environment to be more targeted towards our learners as individuals and give them educational materials in real time um, that we thought would connect with them and be sort of a more modern approach using some technology to improve the educational environment.
Yeah, there's background research in human memory that contextual learning, of course, improves memory. So I think we all do a little bit of contextual learning, most often in-room teaching. And the
Mm-hmm.
teaching that the faculty does is usually directed around whatever case they're working on. So I think that's true. I think on the con side is we've had a challenge of making sure that the trainees go through some sort of all the things that they might not encounter in the cases that they're doing, because there's also research that shows if you just do learning around cases that they are involved in, then you have a very different experience from resident 1 to resident 2 to resident 3, because obviously they experience different cases and different attendings. But I still think that the contextual learning is important, and it's actually the one that's most well received by the trainees because they really want to learn about the thing that they're doing. All right, so how did you go about solving this problem?
So what we our goal in doing this sort of targeting these educational resources, the approach we took was to build actually what would be modeled after a clinical decision support system. So clinical decision support systems are common in medicine now, and generally the way they work is they take in some information as like a sort of data acquisition, and then they process that and then have like a notification module. And so what we did was we looked at the used the schedules and the case assignments to take in information about where the residents were and what cases they were doing the next day, and also what faculty they were with, and then built a library of educational resources, and then tried to built this notification model to essentially provide these educational resources to the residents and eventually the faculty the night before, um, that were targeted towards the cases they were doing. So, for example, the residents would get an email that said, "Here's an article that is relevant to the case that you're doing tomorrow. You should read it. This is sort of a just-in-time teaching intervention." And then we also provided that in the second phase of our study to the faculty um, to do exactly what you were saying. Usually we rely on the faculty to do this sort of case-based teaching, but that's difficult. Our faculty are pulled in a lot of directions, and it's hard for them um, teach in a meaningful way based on each case. So we wanted to support our faculty by providing these resources and say, here's an article you could use that your resident will read that you can use as sort of a teaching tool for the case that you're working on that resident with tomorrow.
It sounds like an amazing idea. I'm a little worried now because now I've got to build a clinical decision support system. Of course, we all have electronic medical records, so
Mm-hmm.
there would be ability, and we all have a scheduling system that would list which case and which resident and which faculty were assigned to that case. But I'm smelling technology here and technological expertise. So first, tell us your background a little bit. Did you have to have a specialized background to be able to understand and solve this problem?
Yeah, so I have an engineering background, but I was never a very good programmer until a year or two ago, and certainly I had to like brush up on my programming skills to solve this problem. I think that there you mentioned some of the barriers. So we did not delve into the EMR because the electronic medical record, the patient record, has so much protected information, and sort of moving data in and out of that system is very complicated from a security standpoint. So as you said, we have a schedule and assignments that are sort of de-identified from the patient, and so we used that without the patient information. Now it does require some local building based on how your schedule is written. Um, but I want to say
Let me
that
just
we,
back up and ask a technical part of
yeah.
that. So, would it be possible to write what's called an application programming interface, an API,
Mhm.
that would strip the required data for your clinical decision support engine
Mhm.
out of our scheduling system? And is that complicated to write that
So
API?
that's a good question. So it would not be possible based on the clinical decision support system that we made, but that would be a great way to move forward. Currently, if someone wanted to replicate this, we'd be happy to work with them and help them build sort of the programming that would be necessary to sort of do this in their system. And what you're suggesting is actually probably the perfect way to um, make this easier for multiple people to replicate, right? Um, it, uh,
Let's talk about the pieces that you would need, I think, to make this
Mhm. Yeah,
replicable for the rest of us. And
yeah,
I sure hope you do it.
yeah.
The problem is because it's really hard for our individual institutions. I can think of Vanderbilt would be really good at this because
Mhm.
they've got people that are really their clinical decision support people are awesome
Mhm.
in their relationship with their anesthesia department. But the rest of us, I don't know that we'd be able to do it. But
Yeah.
so what I would say is we need a piece where we would have to do each institution would have to do some custom programming, but it
Mhm.
would be minimal and it would just say, hey, we need the following fields from the scheduling system. We need the date, we need the faculty name, we need the resident name, and we need the case. So
Mhm.
I don't know, whatever some description, whether it's CPT code or something like that related to the case. And is it the CPT code that you pull up?
So
How do
we
you talk
based
about the case?
yeah, so we based ours off a couple things. So let me say one thing. So building it like something that's replicatable on the programming side would have been more challenging, and so I think it was important for us to take something on that was like that we could
Yeah,
achieve,
no,
right?
no, I got it. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what we used actually was sort of like we cheated and used markers that we know on our schedule. Like we know what cases are done in certain rooms, what cases are done by certain surgeons, and so we pulled
Oh,
out
okay.
keywords from the schedule. And we know that a certain surgeon, for example, might always do Parkinson's surgery, or in a certain room that does limb salvage, those patients are going to be diabetic and have cardiovascular disease. So we used like markers from our schedule. That we knew,
Okay.
right?
So a little bit of a misnomer. It wasn't truly for sure the case. Like, oh, I've got a hepatobiliary case today, or tomorrow I'm doing a limb amputation. I'd get an article on amputations and anesthesia. Instead, I see you're extrapolating the information as best you can based on the surgeon and the room.
Exactly. And sometimes what the case actually is, if the case name is specific to like a resource that we wanted to provide. So for example, if it's like we talked about Parkinson's, if it's a deep brain stimulator implant, we could extract that from the case name. Um, and so we use sort of a variety of keywords from the schedule. Um,
All right.
I-
So it sounds like we need two other pieces, right? So let's say we're able to extract some information from the schedule. The next
mhm,
thing we need is a list of faculty and residents and their email addresses. And then the
exactly.
last piece that we need is a list of educational resources and tags, right there. Each one
Exactly.
is going to be tagged with, these keywords OR12. Whenever the word OR12 shows up, this thing shows up in the clinical decision support, or this CPT code, this surgeon name, whatever identifiers you're going to do in terms of the case. Okay.
Yeah, exactly right. So that last part was like sort of the notification module. We had the residents and their email addresses. And so we did the processing and then we did the notification. And um, those parts are easily transferable and sort of replicatable. They're much more standard because they don't involve, the schedule necessarily.
Right. And I apologize if, for our studio audience, but, I obviously have some sort of an engineering background also to be able to understand this part. But I'm really pushing our good Dr. Gopwani here towards doing the work for the rest of us. So
Uh,
that's what I'm pointing out is that those modules, what would be required, assuming we wanted to replicate this at different institutions, is we probably have to have a every institution would have to come up with an API to draw things out of their schedule.
mhm.
And I guess there'd be no way to, if you were just drawing from the schedule, um, I believe the scheduling systems probably do contain the CPT code or a descriptor of the case. It would be because if it was just a descriptor, then you have to do natural language processing on the descriptor to try and draw out exactly what the case is. Because I don't know if they're really good about external fixator or XFix or or that. So that's one phase. Easy
Mhm.
for all of us to it could be something import something simple as a spreadsheet that had your faculty and your resident list, and then on
Mhm.
the other end, everybody, of course, would have to come up with their own educational resources and the tags. And then your different modules, your clinical decision support and your notification module would be able to take those things in.
Yeah, and even the educational resources to be distributed could be somewhat standardized. We used 144 articles that were mapped to 12 CA1 rotations. Um, and if if we wanted to try to offer that kind of tool or study it in another setting, um, I don't think that another institution would have to start from scratch, right? We could probably use a lot of the same resources if we could just figure out where your residents are and what cases they're doing.
So let me make sure I understand this. You would be willing to work with another institution that happened to be named OHSU, and in that project would work on trying to make the tools more generalizable, so that
Absolutely.
we could, in this next phase, we could make it easier for everyone else to adopt.
Absolutely, because the ideas that you're saying are really spot on. I mean, in terms of making it generalizable, though that is a very reasonable like next step for this work. I
Okay.
think the programming and the computer science side is really exciting to me. Um, and I would be absolutely willing to work with your group or with really any other institution that's excited about this work to
No, no,
try to replicate it.
OHSU, OH. No, I'm just kidding.
I would,
But yeah, if we did do the work to try and make it generalizable, then your work with other institutions would be minimal then at that time. But
yeah.
we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Mhm.
Just sort of assuming that this was awesome because I love the idea. But
Yeah.
let's talk about outcomes. So tell us a little bit about when you launched it, what its first iteration looked like, maybe any educational outcomes or feedback you got, and then how did you modify the project based on that?
Yeah, so we basically we did a two-phase study and we enrolled all of our CA1s. We have 12 CA1s and we enrolled all of them. This was about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. Um, and the first thing we did is do this sort of randomized controlled process and do a crossover study. So we brought the residents over 4 months in and out of this directed reading program. where 1 month we would offer them the directed readings, and then the next month we wouldn't, and so on and so forth. And we just measured how much they were reading. They self-evaluated how much they were reading. So in that first phase, over 4 months, we got great outcomes that showed that when the residents were in the directed reading program, they read approximately 3 hours more per week.
What was the average number of hours per week that they would read?
So the average, so we had a couple numbers started with. The historic average that all
Base,
residents,
yeah.
yeah, the baseline was for our residents 6 hours per week. But the way we did our study, we looked at change from baseline each month. So residents report reading a lot at the beginning. The first month, they're all reading 6 hours per week. As the months go on during the year, resident reading drops off significantly.
To
And
about what?
at the end of the year, residents often don't report reading at all, or under an hour per week in the last month of the year. So we took
Fascinating.
we took all of that into account in the way we controlled it. So for example, we see those variations at times that are near the ITE or
Yes.
boards. The reading goes up, and at other times, the reading goes down. So there's ebbs and flows, and we controlled for that.
Okay, so let's just, so from our colleagues' standpoint,
Mhm.
from an education research standpoint, I see that that was a problem. If you didn't have these ebbs and flows in the
Mhm.
natural history of reading habits, which would be a lot more at the beginning of your CA 1 year and right before any sort of exam
Yeah,
periods,
right.
it would be much easier if you had a level baseline, and then you could compare that, and then you could compare against your intervention.
Mhm.
And with the outcome being number of hours read per week. Um,
Mhm.
that was interesting. I don't know. Are you able to explain a little bit better how you were able to control from that? That actually sounds a little challenging statistically.
It made our study design much more complicated because we felt there's three essential confounders. Okay, each resident has different reading habits. Um, the time throughout the year impacts the month of the year impacts reading habits, and also the rotation. Right, some people might read a lot. One rotation might involve a lot more reading than another. Um, and so we used our crossover study design to control for that. So for example, each month we had residents who were enrolled and residents who were not enrolled. And the residents who were not enrolled were the control. So for example, in September, in October, in November, each month we had 6 residents enrolled and 6 residents not enrolled. And the residents that were not enrolled were the controls. So um, so that's how we controlled for the time point in the year.
Okay, I'm no statistician,
Mhm.
but this is the kind of study that definitely would involve big
Yeah,
time statistics from my standpoint. I'd have to make
definitely.
sure that I had a statistical consultant, not just, and when you're doing a study like this, that you understand that you've got some major confounders that are going to go on. It's a great idea to engage the statistician at the study design phase because you hate to find that out after you've done your study. It makes it a lot more difficult. But so they would have helped in that crossover design and made sure that they felt that the crossover design adequately controls for the confounders that you've identified. I think also there may be some other way to do a secondary. I'm not sure I'm using even the right terminology because, again, I'm not a statistician, but they can go backwards and look at the data and correlate outcomes based on these other confounders to try and find out how much of a predictor they were of outcome and then adjust the outcome based on that. And I think that might be a different technique than just saying that we're using the crossover, and they may go in conjunction with each other. Do you have more expertise that you might be able to expound on that, what you heard from your statisticians?
Well, yeah, I'll tell you, I was really lucky because I've had a lot of I faced a lot of these statistical challenges and struggled in prior research, but this work was actually done through the mentorship of a faculty development program. So within MedStar, we have like an education scholars program. It's a 2-year longitudinal faculty development program to develop education leaders within the institution. Within that program, I actually had really wonderful research mentorship and statistical support. And so in the design of this study, that was really meaningful in making sure that these things were controlled for well. I don't think that we would have come up with this crossover sort of study where, for example, in patient studies, the equivalent is patients are moving in and out of the study the study grew.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, so that luckily we had that statistical support to help
Right.
us
And
when
that's
we were.
probably not a common design for people that aren't in the know, so to speak, beginners. So that's a good one. So the takeaway message just for all of us was the engagement and appropriate statistical support at the beginning to help design your study. Actually, that's good advice for any study, but just in particular when you know you have known confounders. And then also, this was a very interesting research design about the subjects that are moving in and out of the study or a control group or intervention group throughout the period. So I think that's super interesting. All right, well, what did you find? You said you found, I'm just trying to get some baselines. So it
Yeah.
sounded like the reading started out maybe as heavy as 6 or 7 hours a week in the normal resident without any intervention, and it fell almost to zero, which I think we probably, yeah, hear that a little bit. Um, and then, but in the study, what you found that even above those normal variations based on time, you found an increase of how many hours? 3 to 4 hours?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. So above the, even aside from the normal variations, we saw that in our first phase, we did a two-phase study. In our first phase, which was basically July, August through December, um, resident reading increased when they were provided with these case-based resources by 3 hours per week. Our second phase of the study was the last month of the year, and in that phase, we saw that, as I said, residents at baseline had stopped reading altogether. But when we provided these case-based readings, residents read an hour a day more, and so we that was the finding that we were most excited about. That we were getting our residents to go home and read for an hour, like 7 hours per week more when they were enrolled in this.
So I did have some questions about that because being the leader of the anesthesia toolbox,
Mhm.
we have found that when we're designing curricula for residents, that we had to limit. When we first started out, we were super enthused faculty and said, "Oh, you should do this and you should do that. When you're on your rotation in your first week, we want you to read this and do this and do this." And it turned out to be too much.
Mhm.
We found that the resident capacity based on their workload, their home life, and other things was really only in the about the 5 hour a week range
Mhm.
for being able to do some level of education. So I was thinking as you were presenting this project that you're pushing right up against that upper limit. And did you get any feedback that it was hard to do the reading? Because reading a paper, one paper, if you read it carefully, that if unless they just cruise the abstract and the results, that which is going to be another question. So tell me about did you get anything about the feedback about this was a lot of reading?
Yeah, so that's interesting. That's really interesting to hear. So when we in the intervention group, we provided three resources, three readings a week, 12 in a month. And we certainly felt like providing a reading or a resource every day would be too much.
Okay, I thought it was every day based on the schedule.
Yeah, we did 12 a month for first because like I said, we thought every day would be too much, but also because residents go on vacation, go on call, pre-call, post-call, and so providing a resource every day wouldn't have really been we wouldn't have been able to like replicate that for every resident in a regular way. But 12 a month we could replicate even when residents went on vacation or whatever, we could sort of make up for that. Um, yeah, and in that last, I was saying an hour a day, but really in that last um phase, we saw readings of about 6.25 hours a week, and so we may be pushing right up against that 5 hour limit that you were saying.
Well,
Um,
mine's an anecdotal finding. I don't have a real research finding. So I was just curious whether the residents could conceivably say, "We love this,
mhm.
but you know, I can't do this." So 3 papers a week is what you basically landed on. Or I'm sorry,
Exactly.
I guess I'm misinterpreting this because we should actually go about what it was the intervention. When you assigned reading, I heard some different things. Tell us a little bit about specifically, were they articles or were there other kinds of resources other than just like articles?
Yeah, so the vast majority of them were articles, but there were some other things sprinkled in. So, for example, on our airway rotation, one thing we provided was like a video or resources on how to do an awake fiber optic. Some things may have been like ASA protocols or guidelines that we thought were relevant to certain rotations. Um, but for the most part, they were articles. And when you were in the intervention group, you got 12 in the month, usually 3 a week. But again, if a resident went away on vacation for a week, we made up for that in the month and still provided 12 in the month. And then, like, one thing I should say is that when we talk about outcomes, we focused initially heavily on resident reading, but we also looked at knowledge outcomes. We did pre and post examinations.
My next question was other outcomes.
Yeah, so we did pre and post tests where we mapped the questions to the rotations, and tried to see how knowledge acquisition changed when residents were enrolled in the program. And we saw an increase there.
Wait, let me just make sure I clarify. So for every rotation, there was a pre and a post test. And
So,
one resident that's on a rotation for that month might not be in the intervention group, whereas another resident could be. So you were continually measuring pre and post test every month.
so we administered the exams at the beginning and the end of the study block.
Okay, not per rotation.
Yeah,
Okay.
but the questions on the exams were mapped to the rotations. So a resident got a 48 question exam, but really we knew that that was 4 question exams that were matched, that were aligned to each of the rotations that they had gone through.
Okay.
And so we had a rotation-based exam, um, but we didn't make them do it every month. We had them do it a pre-exam and then 4 months later a post-exam.
Okay.
And then we pulled out the questions and like that were mapped to these rotations and tried to see how did their knowledge improve in each of these subspecialty topics based on whether they were enrolled and received directed readings or whether they were in a control group.
Yeah, and again, you'd have that statistical problem of you comparing one rotation set of questions to another set of rotation questions would be challenging because you have no ability to know that those questions are more or less difficult. And so, but because of your study design of having a control group within that rotation, that happened to account that not happened to, but that was designed to account for that confounder.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So that part again was complicated, and our statistician helped us with that. But we had like the same number of residents in the control group and in the intervention group for each rotation.
Okay.
So that was all controlled for.
And what did you find on the
So
knowledge acquisition?
in this case, we saw improvements in test results, but they did not reach statistical significance. And I think that we were probably a bit underpowered. But also, I think we also accepted that just the single intervention or getting residents to read more doesn't necessarily translate fully to knowledge acquisition, and that is a more complex outcome. So to be more specific, the baseline average scores were about 6 out of 12 for a rotational exam. And when residents were enrolled, they went up to about 9 to 10 out of 12 questions correct. And when they weren't enrolled, they were about 7 to 8. So we saw about like a 10%, 10, 15% increase in the exam scores when residents were enrolled. And that, again, that was not statistically significant.
Okay, so we've got a couple of things to chat about there. So
Mhm.
one is there's other reasons why their knowledge could improve even if they weren't doing reading it because of the in-room teaching or the lectures they're going to, so that over time you would expect during a rotation that they're hopefully if their baseline knowledge didn't improve, well, we are in big trouble.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
and
Mhm.
so that probably is what was one of the big issues. And I'm going to point this out for our faculty. This is one of the reasons that education research is difficult in anesthesia programs. You have what I'm going to describe as a medium-sized program with 12 residents per year in a class. And so it does make it very hard to get studies that are powered because you don't have enough subjects to be able to do. You're only going to have 6 with 12 residents. You only got 6 in one group and 6 in the other group. It makes it super challenging to do education research. And that means that you then have to add another gigantic level of complexity, which is to do a multi-institutional study. And that means that your IRB and all of those things has to be done at 2 institutions and coordinating. And so it does make it a lot more challenging. On the other hand, if you are successfully able to take on a multi-institutional project, it increases the power of your study, and it also increases the generalizability of your results because you were able to demonstrate that it works at more than one institution. But so I can see definitely why you might have had power issues on that. Did you look at any other outcomes? Because if you only use a time-based outcome, when you're looking at education research, you've got one limitation of the study is the fact that you're using self-reported logs of amount of reading. And there can be biases like, I don't want to report that I'm not doing very much reading. But there's also no other way to know that someone did a piece of education that you gave them, because even if you do things like measuring screen time, I could walk away and get a cup of coffee or go watch a movie and come back. There's no guarantee that you did that. So there's a variety of study designs that have tried to account for how much eyeball time that you actually spend on a piece of content. But that also is a challenge when you're looking at that as an outcome. All right, so did you look at any other outcomes like satisfaction, evaluation scores, the resident scores at the end of the year and how they evaluate, faculty, curious about how the faculty outcomes worked out.
Yeah. So, and I want to mention one thing about what you said. You're right about the statistical significance. It's very hard to reach statistical significance with some of these education studies, and that's one thing that I sort of learned going through this process. When I look at education studies now, I accept that not every study is going to have statistical significance, but there's other sort of impact factor, stats that we can look at that can also be meaningful. We would have loved to have like a historic data set and look at ITE scores and board exam rates, but we just didn't have like the time and the data to do that. But that would have been ideal if we had that. We did
That's
look at
common for, not, I shouldn't say common, but it is a common thought when people are doing education research, particularly in these areas, the high stakes exams,
I
is
would
to
encourage
try and
people
work
not.
with the ABA. And sometimes you can work with the ABA
Uh,
to try and get those results, but it is a whole nother level of complexity in doing the study.
yeah, and I would encourage people not to be too deterred if you don't think you can reach statistical significance because of a small number of residents. I mean, that's a common problem in med ed. And so I think uh, otherwise we wouldn't be able to do too much education, a lot of education research. Uh,
Like I said, the one way around it is, if you can do it, is to try to work with a couple of neighboring institutions or institutes that you have a good relationship with. Because a lot of times you can take your IRB, there's two different methods. One is you can take your IRB and you can try and get the other institution's IRB to accept what
mhm,
you've done as an IRB. That's sort of one method. And sometimes if your study intervention is very low impact,
mhm.
they have an expedited process at IRBs to review research, which often education research falls into, which isn't the same as giving somebody a drug or not.
Mhm.
So sometimes there's that, and then also, even if you have to work with two IRBs, the same documents that you created, the other person on your co-partner on the other institutions may have to massage all of those things that you put together to fit in their IRB format, but it can be done. And so sometimes that, like I said, that can be helpful, even if you can just do one other one to help you get. So I don't want to deter people from saying, yes, it's okay, you can work on projects that you might not reach statistical significance, but you do have some avenues to try and approach it if you wanted to try and tackle it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there's so many advantages of doing it multi-institution. I mean, there's so many confounders and uh sort of limitations that are overcome by getting like a different type of system or different group of residents involved. And so I would love to do more of that sort of work, and it also allows us to network with other education resources.
Yes, that's a great point. I'm sorry, I should have brought that up. And that's very important in your professional development, is to begin to develop your network outside of your institution. All right, let's talk about some of the softer outcomes, though.
Yeah,
What did the residents tell you? What was your anecdotal feedback? And also, we've got to go talking about the faculty. I want to interested to
yeah.
see what the faculty said.
So we also tried to measure we measured particularly in the second phase how often the faculty use these resources as a teaching tool. We only looked at that in the second phase, which was very short. It was just a month. And we also asked the residents to evaluate the teaching environment in that phase also. So our outcomes on that second phase for those were not as positive. We targeted like 60% bar for faculty discussion rate. We wanted to see the faculty using these articles or resources as a teaching tool 60% of the time, and they only used it 15% of the time. When the faculty did use the resources as a teaching tool, it had a very significant impact on the teaching evaluations.
Can
Um,
we talk about that in just a minute?
mhm.
Because I was curious as to about how the faculty would use the tool. So in theory, are you giving the faculty a different tool? So not the same educational intervention that you gave the resident, the same article or something else? Because otherwise, is it possible that the faculty could say, well, they read the article last night.
Yeah,
I'm not going to talk about it, or I'm not sure. But tell me about what resources were they the same resources or different provided to the faculty?
yeah. So so they were the same resources. We basically provided the same article to the resident, and then we sent it to the faculty and said, your resident is receiving this article to read for their case. Please consider using this as a teaching tool or something to discuss. And the goal really there was to support our wonderful faculty in providing intraoperative education.
Yep.
But ultimately, it was lacking. It was not. I think it was not really. It's something that if I would like to go back and do better, because I think that just providing the faculty with an article that's sort of cold to them that they may not be familiar with, it's not that easy for the faculty to use that as a teaching tool. And ideally, what we should have done is is consider the faculty teaching preferences and and perhaps ask them to sort of vet a list of articles that they would want their resident to get and kind of layer that into the targeting. Um, but we were not really able to achieve that complexity. So we did this. We provided the same resource that the residents were getting. And like I said, I think it was really lacking in effectiveness.
This is a super interesting topic, and I think we need to delve into this a little bit. So, you give the faculty a resource, and you end up finding out that it's underutilized essentially, and the question is why. And so you hinted a little bit about it. Is sort of not invented here. It wasn't the article I chose.
Mhm.
Somebody else chose this article for me to discuss, and therefore it had a little bit of a less of an uptake. Um, so I can say that we've had a similar experience. We tried to provide, instead of articles, we provided what we called a mini PVLD,
Mhm.
a board style case based discussion with intended for about 15 minutes of in room teaching.
Mhm.
Um, Now, it wasn't related to that case, so slightly different scenario in that part. And we even printed them out and put them and it not only had the case-based discussion, but it also had the answers in it. So the
Mhm.
faculty could read through, look at the questions in the case, and then read through the discussion points and sort of the expected answer. So it wasn't just basically the questions. And then they were either printed out right out there in a box so the faculty could pick them up that day. Now they weren't given to them the night before. And we also found similarly bell-shaped curved uptake,
Mhm.
um, skewed to the left, which
Uh,
is the not used of these educational resources. We did find that when the residents, when they were used, there was a high amount of satisfaction on the resident level
mhm.
when the faculty did it. So again, so now I got questions. So what do you think? As an education researcher now, why are faculty not doing this? And if we go back to the model of, well, we are only going to use things that the faculty are familiar with, the article, then we get that highly skewed educational experience, just based on the faculty.
I think it's a great question, and really, like, I commend you for what you tried to do. I think you're trying to answer the same question, which is how do we support intraoperative teaching? How do we support our faculty who, um, are asked to do like sort of more with less every day, right? Now we have to run around and see, cover more rooms and do more charting, and we want to support the faculty in spending this time doing this bedside teaching. Um, I think that um, it sounds like we ran into a similar problem, or that the the faculty need to be like, it needs to be, I think, targeted, and the faculty need to be engaged because people want to teach on topics that they're comfortable with. Um, you know, and uh, I think that probably the PBLDs, it sounds like that you provided, were a bit better than what we provided, in that you had the answers also, and you would think that it would lend itself to uptick, but I think that there's given how busy, like I said, the faculty are and how much is asked of them, I think that it just means more needs to be done um, to uh, to make that process easier, to make that
Right.
process
So I
more
think
intensive somehow.
what I'm hearing is, of course, it would be probably if we just said you only do, you do less rooms and less cases, we'd see better teaching. Okay, that's not an option,
It's not an
unfortunately.
option, right? Yeah, we accept that.
So one difference was we didn't provide ours the night before, and I think that probably would be helpful, is to provide it to the faculty maybe even the morning of the day before. So
Mhm.
that way they would have maybe have already read it or gone through it when they do their pre-op evaluation, which usually happens at somewhere between 4 and 6 p.m. For us, I don't know about for you guys, when the residents actually contact you and say, let's go over our cases for tomorrow. um, Having done the reading or be prepped before that would be potentially helpful if the information was case directed about that case.
Yeah, I mean, I think the approach that we're going to take in the next step in like the future direction of our work is we're going to ask the faculty what are the topics that you want to teach a CA1, a CA2, a CA3 about, and refine those articles, engaging the faculty much more actively, and then use the same model to provide like those resources to the residents, and hope that that makes it very easy for the faculty to teach on a topic that they're comfortable with, that they enjoy teaching about, um, and we're gonna hope that um, or see if that helps.
Yeah, okay, so that's what we do. I think I heard two things. One is just having the faculty as opposed to some outside force
Hmm.
coming in and saying, these are the articles you will teach.
Hmm.
Engaging the faculty in the beginning of the design of the educational intervention and which articles and which PBLDs or whatever it is that we're going to teach, I
Hmm.
think help probably with the buy-in essentially from the faculty in terms of the process. Then you went even a step further, which was, you said that what I heard is that the engine would only supply, the faculty would only ever teach on those particular items and those that they're comfortable with, and those are the items that would then be sent to the resident that's working with them.
That's what our goal is going to be for the next step for us in terms of trying to improve that outcome, is to improve the targeting and individualize it in that way, because that way we're supporting the residents, but we're also supporting the faculty.
Interesting, because what it may in there, we can look at, and it'll be great to look at your results, because you can see some different potential outcomes to that. One is that you might get better faculty engagement, but you may get less knowledge acquisition, because
Hmm.
again, you've got a much narrower set of things that the faculty potentially are willing to talk about, and you have no assurity that you're going to get coverage of the knowledge base that you really wanted to teach. Right, well, that's the goal of a rotation,
Yeah.
is to teach a knowledge base. It
Hmm.
isn't to just teach on the particular cases, or whatever it is that you want. The whole theory of the rotation is that there's going to be some sort of knowledge base that's acquired. All right, well,
Hmm.
this is one of the most interesting projects. Fantastic work. You are a skilled education researcher now, I think, and this type of project, I would point it out, I think would have been highly fundable by FAIR.
Hmm.
So the Foundation for Anesthesia Education and Research, not now, even though they say anesthesia education and research, the vast majority of projects that people submit to FAIR for FAIR grants as young investigators are actually not education research whatsoever. They are, you know, basic clinical or even bench type research. But they do accept anesthesia projects. So this kind of project, what you could go for, if you as a prior FAIR grant winner, I can say that this project seems to me to would be high would have a high opportunity for being funded through FAIR. And what that means is that you get 2 guaranteed non-clinical days, a point four of an FTE for 2 years. to do your project, and then FAIR pays your department, the grant money, and it's, somewhere around 100,000 it was, and it may be a little bit more than that. I apologize. It might be 150,000 now, but that's the general ballpark of what we've been talking about. And this kind of project, very well thought out. What you do is you have a little bit of pilot data, and you get a great project, and you can present it. I think this would be fundable.
Well, yeah, I really appreciate it. I think that I've gained so many new thoughts and insights from your suggestions. I think that this has given me a lot to think about in terms of the directions for this project. And just for your audience, anybody who is interested in trying to pursue this kind of work for targeting educational resources to residents or faculty, please feel free to connect with me. I'm looking forward to working with your group at OHSU, or with anyone who's interested in collaborating on this sort of initiative.
I think just to finish up, a broader concept about targeting, similar to what we hear about people's social media feed being targeted to them. My vision for, and not just my own, but I believe what I think is going to be happening in education in the next 5 to 10 years, because it takes a long time to do, is that residents will have a feed of targeted information, but that information is going to be based on what rotation they're on. It's going to be based what cases that they're doing, which faculty they're working with, what their activity is on an educational site, so which things that they are viewing. So the AI is determining, what information they're like and don't like. And then also potentially based on their knowledge-based performance on quiz banks. So you can see as another part of that, the AI would have multiple things to look at to decide what things to target you for your education on. Oh, I see Glenn's going to be doing a such and such case tomorrow with Dr. Gopwani, and Glenn is particularly weak because based on his test questions in this area, here's a couple of questions to talk about tomorrow, and here's a little article to go with it. Something like that, I think, is what the future of education is. So this project right here, you are seeing, I think, is cutting edge in terms of where education is going. So thanks so much for being our guest speaker today. Great, great project.
Yeah, thank you so much. I agree. I think the education technology landscape is going to grow, and Anesthesia Toolbox is obviously a great example of that. And there's many directions that that this landscape will grow in.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.